Formula One teams are not just protesting because they lost positions. They are protesting because the result itself no longer feels safe. A podium was taken away over a pit lane speed reading barely above the limit. Then the sport admitted a measurement problem. Then Gasly got his podium back, Russell could not get his race repaired, McLaren launched an appeal, Mercedes searched for legal options, and Red Bull was pulled into the chaos. That is not a normal penalty dispute. That is the moment every team realizes the same terrifying truth. The system can punish you instantly, but if the system is wrong, it may not be able to undo the damage. And if that happens in a title-deciding race, Formula One will not have a controversy. It will have a championship crisis. Subscribe to the channel. At first, this looked like another angry Formula One weekend. The kind every fan recognizes. A penalty appears. A team principal gets furious. A driver says the decision makes no sense. Fans split instantly. Half of them defend the rulebook, and the other half say the sport has lost control again. Usually, that is where the story ends. The outrage rises, the interviews get clipped, the paddock moves to the next race, and everyone pretends the problem has been solved because the calendar keeps moving. But this time, the calendar could not bury it. Because the protests were not really about one penalty. They were about something much more dangerous. The belief that Formula One's own system can change a result, admit a problem later, and still leave teams with damage that cannot be fully repaired. That is why the mood changed. This was not just Alpine being angry. It was not just Mercedes being frustrated. It was not just McLaren protecting its result. It was not just Red Bull watching a driver get pulled into the fallout. It was all of them seeing the same weakness from different angles. And once multiple teams start seeing the same weakness, the sport has a problem. Formula One can survive controversy. It almost feeds on it. Rivalries, protests, aggressive calls, emotional radio messages, and bitter interviews are part of the show. But Formula One cannot survive without trust. Teams need to trust the clock. Drivers need to trust the rules. Engineers need to trust the data. Fans need to trust that the checkered flag still means something. Monaco shook that trust. Pierre Gasly crossed the line in third place for Alpine, and for a few moments, it looked like one of those rare results that changes the feeling around an entire team. Alpine had been under pressure. Gasly had fought for a result that mattered. The garage had a reason to believe the effort had finally paid off. Then the penalties arrived. 2 separate 5-second penalties for pit lane speeding. Third place became 7th. A podium became a punishment. And the numbers were so small that the whole paddock had to look twice. The reported speeds were barely above the limit. Around 60.1 kilometers per hour, then around 60.4, in a pit lane limited to 60. To ordinary people, that sounds almost ridiculous. To Formula One, it was enough to erase a podium. That is where the first layer of anger came from. But the second layer was much worse. Alpine argued that Gasly had activated the pit lane speed limiter before entering the pit lane. That detail matters because the limiter is supposed to remove the driver's guesswork. It is there to keep the car within the allowed speed. It is the system drivers and teams rely on in a moment where the margin for error is tiny. So if the limiter was active, and the official measurement still claimed Gasly was speeding, the question became unavoidable. Did the driver fail the rule, or did the measurement fail the driver? That question turned the entire controversy upside down. Because teams can argue about racing incidents forever. Was there enough space? Was the move too aggressive? Did someone force another car wide? Those are judgment calls, and Formula One has lived with judgment calls since the beginning. But pit lane speed is supposed to be different. It is supposed to be objective. It is supposed to be clean. It is supposed to be the kind of number everyone can trust. Either the car was too fast, or it was not. Either the system measured correctly, or it did not. And when the governing body later acknowledged a measurement discrepancy in the pit lane timing loops, the argument became much bigger than Gasly. Because now the teams were not only asking whether one penalty was unfair. They were asking whether the official system had created a false result. That is the kind of question that can spread through a paddock like fire. Because every team depends on official measurement. Every pit entry, every timing line, every sensor, every loop in the track, all of it must be trusted instantly. There is no time during a Grand Prix to stop and audit the system. The race moves too fast. Decisions happen too quickly. And once a penalty is issued, the consequences begin immediately. That is why the protests became so serious. Gasly's penalties could be removed because they were added after the race. Alpine could challenge the decision, the result could be corrected, and Gasly could be restored to third place. But George Russell's situation showed the flaw. Russell's race had already been affected during the Grand Prix. His penalty had already changed his track position, his strategy, his rhythm, and the opportunities available to him. Once that happens, there is no simple way to rebuild the race that should have existed. That is the terrifying difference. A wrong post-race penalty can sometimes be erased. A wrong live race penalty can become permanent damage. And every team understood what that meant. If the system is wrong after the race, you might have a path to justice. If the system is wrong during the race, your result might be gone forever. That is not a small technical problem. That is a sporting crisis. Because Formula One championships can turn on tiny margins. One podium. One lost point. One penalty served at the wrong time. One decision that pushes a driver into traffic and destroys a strategy. Those moments do not stay isolated. They shape seasons. They affect morale. They affect contracts. They affect constructor standings. They affect the way the world judges a driver's year. So when teams saw Monaco produce damage the system could not fully repair, they did not just see a controversial penalty. They saw a warning. Today it happened to Alpine. Today it damaged Mercedes. Today it pulled McLaren and Red Bull into the fight. Tomorrow, it could decide the championship. That is why this scandal is so much bigger than the original pit lane speed reading. The speed reading was the spark. The protests are the fire. And the real fuel is the fear that Formula One's penalty system has become powerful enough to change results, but not strong enough to restore fairness when its own process fails. Then the protests revealed something even more uncomfortable. The teams were not all angry for the same reason. And that is what made the scandal harder to control. If every team had been making the exact same complaint, Formula One could have focused on one solution. Fix the measurement. Remove the penalty. Adjust the result. Move on. But Monaco created several different forms of damage at the same time. Alpine could say the original penalty was wrong. Mercedes could say the same wider chaos damaged a race that could not be rebuilt. McLaren could say the correction created a new unfair outcome. Red Bull could say its driver was dragged into a shifting classification through no fault of his own. That is why this became so dangerous. The controversy did not produce one victim. It produced several. And each one had a different version of the truth. For Alpine, the case was emotional and simple. Gasly crossed the line in third. The penalties arrived. The podium disappeared. Then the sport acknowledged a measurement issue, and the penalties were removed. From Alpine's point of view, that was justice. A driver got back what a flawed system had taken away. But Mercedes looked at the same situation and saw the part nobody could easily fix. George Russell's race had already been changed while it was happening. That is the difference that sits at the center of everything. When a time penalty is added after the race, it lives on a results sheet. If it is wrong, it can sometimes be removed from that sheet. But when a penalty is served during a Grand Prix, it lives inside the race. It changes where the car is on track. It changes who the driver is fighting. It changes the tires. It changes the strategy. It changes the energy used to recover. It changes the risks the driver has to take. And once those changes happen, the race that should have existed is gone. You cannot replay it. You cannot put every car back where it would have been. You cannot give Russell back the exact traffic, tire life, track position, and opportunity he may have had without the penalty. That is why Mercedes' frustration mattered so much. They were not simply asking for sympathy. They were pointing at a gap in the system. Formula One had a way to remove Gasly's post-race penalties. But it did not have a clean way to restore Russell's live race damage. That is the kind of gap teams remember. Because every team knows that one day, the same gap could swallow their result. Then McLaren's protest pushed the crisis into another direction. When Gasly was restored to third place, Alpine gained back the podium. But the reshuffle meant other drivers moved down again. Oscar Piastri was affected by that change, and McLaren had a reason to ask whether the correction itself had produced unfairness. That is where the situation became almost impossible. Because McLaren was not arguing that measurement problems do not matter. They were arguing that the way the correction was applied could punish teams that had acted according to the official situation at the time. And that matters. During a race weekend, teams do not have perfect hindsight. They cannot wait 3 days to decide how cautious their driver should be in the pit lane. They make decisions instantly, based on the information available at that moment. If a team believes there is a risk around pit lane measurement, it might tell its driver to leave extra margin. That extra margin costs time. And in Formula One, time is not a detail. A slow pit entry can ruin an undercut. A cautious approach can put a car behind traffic. A fraction lost in the pit lane can become a position lost on track. So McLaren's question carried real weight. If one team later gets relief, what happens to the teams that lost time trying to avoid the same problem? That is not a small complaint. That is a direct challenge to the fairness of the entire correction. And Red Bull had its own reason to watch the fallout closely. Isack Hadjar was pulled into the shifting result. For a young driver, a podium chance is not just another statistic. It can change confidence. It can change reputation. It can change how the paddock talks about him. It can change how a team evaluates his future. So when a classification moves him toward a major moment, then pulls it away again, the damage is not only mathematical. It is human. That is the part the rule book struggles to measure. A lost podium is not just points. A lost chance is not just position. A result that appears, disappears, and then enters an appeal process creates emotional damage that no table can fully show. And now Formula One had all of that happening at once. Gasly had the original wound. Russell had the irreversible race damage. Piastri had the correction fallout. Hadjar had the disappearing opportunity. Alpine had the restored podium. Mercedes had the unanswered loss. McLaren had the appeal. Red Bull had the reason to fight back. This was no longer a penalty dispute. It was a chain reaction. And every link in that chain made the governing body look more exposed. Because the sport could not offer one clean answer that satisfied everyone. If Gasly keeps third, Alpine feels justice was done, but McLaren and others can argue they were harmed by the reversal. If Gasly loses third again, Alpine can argue a driver is being punished by a measurement problem the sport itself acknowledged. If Russell receives nothing, Mercedes can argue that live race damage is being ignored. If Russell somehow receives compensation, everyone affected by his changed race can ask how far the correction should go. That is the nightmare. Once a race is altered by a disputed penalty, every possible fix creates another dispute. And when every fix creates another dispute, trust begins to collapse. This is why teams are protesting so aggressively. They are not just fighting for one place. They are fighting to avoid being trapped in the next version of the same chaos. Because the next version may not be Monaco. It may not be a podium fight. It may be a championship fight. And if a title is decided by a penalty that the system later cannot fully defend, Formula One will face a crisis much bigger than angry statements and appeal documents. That is why the protest fee increase makes the situation feel even more tense. The cost of filing a protest rose from €2,000 to €20,000. The intention was obvious. Stop weak protests. Stop pointless challenges. Stop teams from turning every frustration into paperwork. But there is a dangerous side to that. A higher cost does not only discourage bad protests. It can also discourage necessary ones. For the largest teams, €20,000 may not be enough to stop a legal fight. But for smaller teams, the barrier matters. And even for big teams, the message is uncomfortable. If the system makes a mistake, challenging it now costs much more. That creates a strange imbalance. The governing body can issue a penalty quickly. The result can change quickly. A driver can lose a podium quickly. But the team trying to challenge the mistake faces a more expensive path, a legal process, and no guarantee that the damage can be fully repaired. That is not how confidence is built. That is how suspicion grows. And suspicion is one of the most dangerous things in Formula One. Because the whole sport depends on trust in invisible things. Fans see the cars. They hear the engines. They see the overtakes. But the race is controlled by data most people never see. Timing loops. Sensors. Pittsburgh lane measurements. Stewarding systems. Telemetry. Official notices. Regulations written in language that only specialists read closely. Everyone accepts those invisible systems because they believe the outcome is fair. But once that belief cracks, everything becomes questionable. A pit lane penalty is no longer just a pit lane penalty. A post-race decision is no longer just a post-race decision. A stewarding note is no longer just paperwork. It becomes a possible threat to the result.